Flash was the way that things were done for a long time, and now we don't need to do that anymore. And in fact, this entire presentation is done in a framework called Reveals.js, which a lot of speakers use. And so each slide is essentially a div element that within this JavaScript framework, when I hit arrow keys here, it actually just applies transformations between them. So this just gives you an idea of how this isn't Flash, this isn't anything like that. It's just all running in the browser. I'm using Chrome on Mac here. So that's me. I am these days I'm even more .NET than UI, and my UI has been limited to WebKit to quite an extent because I work on mobile phones primarily, so mobile Safari and everything. So I'm leaning heavily on the book that we're giving away tonight, and also a very excellent talk that I saw in Austin from a guy who's done a lot with the 3D. That's just a part of it. Okay, so what I'm hoping we can all do here tonight, just make sure we're all, I don't know where we're starting, but walk out of here knowing what CSS3 can do for us, especially in terms of animation. I want everyone to have the basics of 2D, which consists of the transforms and the transitions. How many here have already worked with those to some extent? Okay. I wasn't, since we're competing with the Dallas JS Ninjas talk at the same time in channel, I wasn't sure what our group would be here. So this may be somewhat basic. For people here that would like to chime in with some very advanced stuff as we get to the end, that'd be fantastic.
Hey Mike, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to switch off the lights. Is that okay?
Okay.
Is it good?
I'm wanting to make sure we're sharing around some of the best CSS3 demos, including some things Google has released and just everything else that's out there that we know to be good, and that we're sharing just to inspire us as we do our work as people in the web industry these next few years. There's a lot of amazing work already, and we're going to, in the next 5 years, make it all look completely dated and obsolete, no doubt. But in terms of what's out there now, we're going to see what's there. And then, Michael, I wasn't sure how many people were coming from a Flash background, just wanting to discard that and move on. There are tools that Adobe has made which allow you to skip over actually having to apply these mechanics and write code, or they're, it's all right there in the browser and can be authored from scratch. So whatever those next steps are, hopefully everyone will be happy to do. In terms of browser animation history, I hope I'm not alone in this. I think that at the time, starting with Netscape, back when Flash itself really enabled a lot of amazing things, and it was a good thing that it came to exist. It did a lot of good. We wouldn't have Farmville and all these Facebook games if not for Flash. I'm not sure also if that's good or bad, but if you ever went to a Macromedia Flash seminar, they'd be quick to tell you how it was literally everywhere. They called it Flash penetration, and they ranked it about 97%. As we got into 2003, 2005, they were very excited about that. Apparently, it made a great sale to Adobe. It had a lot of capabilities. You didn't have to worry about anything from the graphics card on the machine to anything else. You could have rich applications that would download data dynamically, render UI, take user interaction, play animations. It was really pretty neat. It had quite a range, and it's widely used, and there's a huge development community, probably still to this day, because it's not dead. It's still on the desktop. It's still, in terms of game performance, it does run a little bit better than HTML5 currently, and so it's still out there. Where it really ends up mattering is when it comes to these mobile devices, these battery-powered things that are not plugged into a wall, that have miniature, non-Pentium, non-Intel chips, and these little ARM chips, and they are less powerful. They are connected to the internet through a lot thinner of a pipe, a straw instead of a tube, really, and running all these old Flash movies that were intended for desktop, especially during the era of broadband, where everything was free. You didn't have to think about bandwidth so much. You didn't have to think about how expensive it was going to be to render an animation or anything like that, then unfortunately, when you get onto a mobile device, you have to start thinking about these things. So that also means that there's a large base of existing Flash games and applications out there, and developers that have really never had to think about these things in terms of the concerns on going to mobile. And that kind of came to a head. Adobe, for quite a while, was trying to get people, or actually they were developing a separate project to create a mobile Flash. And there were several attempts. They still have Flash compilers that will allow you to build to an iOS application from your Flash movie. And it works pretty well, but of course it quickly slows down. There was a famous letter from Steve Jobs to Adobe where he outlines the entire history of how Apple and Adobe have been around, palling around together in Palo Alto since the time of PostScript and printer language standards and all this stuff from many years ago. And did anyone actually see that letter that Steve Jobs sent to Adobe? It's kind of an open letter.
Yeah.
It was not kind. He criticized everything about the Flash framework, saying it would never be right for mobile and it could never work. And what happened after that was almost surprising, especially in the face of such an insulting challenge. The Flash mobile project was ultimately called off, and Adobe started embracing these other standards like CSS3 and building tools in the Adobe Creative Suite to utilize them. Adobe, of course, still sells and supports Flash. Every, Zynga and all their Farmville, Cityville, Castleville, all these things, those are all Flash and Facebook apps. And it's still a huge community. But I think they're also hedging their bet moving towards W3C standards. Everyone know about the W3C? Okay, awesome. So standards like HTML5 and CSS3. So basically, how does this work? It's probably a little bit beneath this crowd, but the browser vendors choose to implement in their own code base for each individual browser. Do we have the Mozilla JavaScript guy here tonight? Luke Wagner? I saw him on our SVP list. He actually contributes to the Mozilla project on the JavaScript. Didn't know if he made it, but every browser decides which of these standards you're going to implement, and they're forced through competitive pressures to implement what everyone else does. So ultimately, because of these, we can just write our code, view it in the browser, and magic happens. Oh yeah. Did I mention the asterisk? So in particular to CSS3 transforms and transitions, we have to put in every single prefix for every single CSS property all the time. It gets to be a bit redundant. There are tools to handle this well. If you're Visual Studio, Microsoft, there's some excellent tools for that. And there are ways around it, but in general, if you're going to be typing these things into Notepad or text edit or something like that, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing redundant tags. Okay, so all of this, unlike, say, a WebGL type of situation where you're dealing with a geometric mesh and it's being rendered to a GL buffer somewhere that gets on the screen, with these types of 2D and 3D transforms, we're actually just manipulating DOM elements, which is really good. Because we all know how to make a div or a table or something like that that contains everything we need. And it can be nested very deep and be complicated and have all kinds of visual presentation on it. And we can just take one of those elements and manipulate. So one of the first rules about this is your DOM elements are going to render normally. We size, we position them, we put nested things into them. And when you start animating them, one of the first questions I had was, will everything else in the DOM flow start resizing? If I have a picture in the middle of a table or something like this, and that's a bad practice, by the way, but if you were to start moving it out, does the table resize as this thing shifts up? And it does not. That's one of the main rules in the spec. So it's the initial DOM flow is all rendered and then we just start moving things within it, and it just gets drawn on top of it with nothing else in the page being affected. Okay, we have one more. Okay, yeah, I think we covered that. It's actually an advantage because if you were to reflow the page every time, it would really slow things down. Has anyone seen the YouTube video of the Gecko DOM rendering flow? Just to sort of, it's the algorithm for how a browser renders the page. Okay, we named it the sidebar because it's pretty cool. Okay, never mind. I'll come back to it. Okay. So the first thing we need to learn about are transforms. So it's not quite like that. It's more like this, the Cartesian plane. So we have where things are going to be, and we begin to shift their coordinates around. This is just as true for 3D later as it is for 2D. So let's say something was, let's see if my mouse pushes there. Something was here, and we transform it 5x, it's going to be over here. If we transform it 5x and 5y, it's going to be up here, and so on. And we can actually give something an original value, give it a transform value, and tell it to transition between those, and the browser will draw for us across the specified amount of time. So that's really the foundation here. Again, going back to the browser prefixes, everything we do, we have to, for whatever browsers we want to support, and let's just assume we want to support them universally, we're going to have to prefix everything. Anything around IE 8 or before, in some cases 9, may not work. We'll get to that. Modernizer will let us switch out our content and present something static that's functional, so we can do progressive enhancement to get what we're trying to do. But everything we have to do, we have to put these on the front of every single CSS property. So if we want to do something, we have to say it 5 times for 5 different browsers.
You said that there were some tools in this, in Visual Studio that allowed you to not have to do this with repeat?
Yeah, Matt Christensen with the Visual Studio team. David, I work with at Match. Do you remember the name? It's like Web Platform Tools or something like that. You can get through NuGet.
Okay.
There's some excellent tools, and while you're editing the style sheet, you can just edit one property, and it will fill in the changes to all of the redundant prefixes for you. So, and there are many tools all over the place. And if you're to do something, if you're to use a tool that uses animation more as a timeline type of metaphor, like Flash, then it abstracts everything away. So you really, it's only the hand coding that you need to do a lot of copying and pasting, and there's some good tools for that too. So our foundational transforms we have this DOM element. We want to apply a CSS property to it. One of the things we can do to it is rotate it. By default, it's origin, going back to, yes, here we go. Its origin is going to be in the middle of the element. So if we have an element that kind of goes from here to here and down here, sort of picture a square there, by default, its transformation origin is going to be in the center. So if you were to then rotate 90 degrees, it's going to use as a sort of a pivot point as it does the calculation, the center of the Cartesian plane. So you can also, okay, so on rotate, sorry. So by default, use the center. You need all the vendor prefixes. You can specify it in degrees, gradients, radians, or even turns. So you say I want a quarter turn. That's exactly equivalent to saying I want to rotate 90 degrees. You can also transform the origin, which is basically moving for the purposes of the specific transform. If this element is still here, if we do a transform origin, it's almost as if this entire grid shifts over to a different place. So in the example of this imaginary square here, where we've got it at 0, 0, if we were to move the transform origin to 5, 5, then it would be on the corner. So when we do a rotation, the square would then pivot around the corner wherever we specify. Okay, we can also scale, specify units in pixels, percentages. This will do both the X and Y. We can also specify individually X and Y. And I think it's time to get to some examples. But in general, we have the transformations and the rotations, and we apply these to CSS properties. So here I'm transitioning into a much better talk. It is about a third or fourth generation. I watched this talk a couple of different years. This is getting into 3D. The first year he's explaining that the X-axis in a 3D transform is like pivoting, and he does this kind of somersault. And that the Z transform is as if he was doing cartwheels. And so I think he actually improved it a lot as we get into this. So on this cover slide here, we actually have a bunch of DOM elements containing these words. And so let's see if I can get them all the same. Full screen. Get everything on the same page for us. Excellent. Okay. Reflow. So we have a bunch of DOM elements containing text. So we have our some of them are transformed 90 degrees, like the ing. And so as we go through it, he applies transforms in the browser. So basically, going back to what I was saying about transforming the origin, you move there's a CSS property to move it to the corner here. And the same on this one here. And so as you go, you just apply that you want to rotate it 180 degrees. And so then we're able to just do all this nice animation.
Is there margins on that element that's making the page shift? Because you mentioned earlier that it maintains the size of the element in the DOM. After the animation, it shouldn't move.
I think what's happening is it's bound to the left and right arrow keys.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually scrolling the browser at the same time, probably a prevent default on the handling of that.
So that's for images each? They're being manipulated?
They're just text nodes inside of a dim that I did, yeah, exactly. And so there's JavaScript bound to the keys that allow us to do this.
Are the text separated by span tags or classes?
I think these are in divs. I was having a little bit of trouble with the inspector just then drilling down to the exact element. If we're patient, we can. He's got them in H1s and spans. And something to keep in mind, if in your DOM hierarchy something is nested within something else, it gets transformed within it. So you can basically, let's say you have an arm and an elbow, you'd have at the shoulder level you'd have an outer div, and if you move that, everything inside it would move, and you could have an inner div inside that, and you could transform just from there down, and so on. And so he's got everything in spans here. And even the model in the model gets revealed entirely. And that's just a scale along the X element that's doing that. Okay, this may be coming up on the 3D part. just going into exactly what. Okay, here's the 3D part. And this is done with text shadows. It's multiple text shadows, one that's blue, and one that's red applied to. So let's see if we can get the effect. Depth, and then, is that working for anybody?
No.
I think it's too dark to detect the red and the blue.
It is working a little bit for me.
That's the problem with projectors.
Yeah.
So, going on, he does a fantastic job on this. So you have the translate 3D CSS property, and you specify it with 3 arguments, the X, the Y, and the Z. And so the X is just back and forth horizontally, as you'd expect. Y is the same thing. And Z is a little more easy for us. It's like the cube is there. And so what's going on is that the browser is actually doing all the transformations on the DOM rendering. All the stuff in WebGL that you'd worry about having to multiply over the matrix and everything, it's just doing that independently. You also have the 3D rotations, and so that same, if you were to imagine a line going horizontally that you were shifting along, which is kind of intuitive for the X. When you rotate along X, it's pivoting off of that same line on whatever your transform origin is. And the same is true through the Y, that same vertical. Go ahead.
Is there a version that, I don't know if this is possible, but is there a version that does uses polarized light so that you can, you're not relying on the colors and stuff?
There's something that's just now coming out in development mode. Anyone here heard of John Carmack?
Yeah.
Woo-woo! Yeah, exactly. So the guy who, with much caffeination and pizza, wrote Wolfenstein and Doom and all of these 3D engines, and it's just absolutely speaks at cigarette after and cool techniques. He is CTO of a new company that is called Oculus 3D, and they have a product called the Oculus Rift. And I pre-ordered the dev kit on that one. And there's actually a bridge to go from WebGL into the Oculus Rift. It's literally this old idea of the VR goggles, where you have little LCD panels in front of each eye, and as you move, it tracks the movement, and it's stereoscopic without having to do red or blue. And that is coming for WebGL. So.
Because when they show 3D images like Avatar,
Yeah.
aren't those like polarized glasses they use?
Or they're alternating shutter, like LCD, so it will black out one eye when the TV is doing the image for the other eye, and it goes back and forth, so they have little infrared and they sync up with your TV. There are a number of variations on the technology, so whatever your 3D projector or 3D television is, it just has to all sync up. Like VHS and Betamax or anything else, it's just, there are many competing standards.
But the one you're talking about doesn't work that way, it works the one with the tracking.
Yeah, no, it's kind of ridiculous looking, but they're awesome to wear, as opposed to those nice ones you have in the theater or something like that. That actually shows you separate images on both sides.
Did you do a more complicated image, or like did you do a 3D image and use it horizontally?
You could, probably what you would want, if you were going to tell your website visitors to put on glasses like this, which isn't much of a use case, right? But if you were, you could separate out in Photoshop and sort of tint multiple transparent PNGs to represent the different channels and do something like that. So you'd have, say you have 2 PNGs, one that represents the right eye and one that represents the left eye. They've both been tinted to be picked up with these things, just as an example. And then you could move them out in the foreground or something like that. Yeah.
What about something like a cube instead of a square or a sphere?
You could do the same thing. You could actually have, you'd have to actually deal with a lot of it yourself with CSS, but you could have a reddish cube and a bluish cube that were both rendering semi-transparently transformed to the same spot, and that would do the same effect.
Well, on the object that you just spun around, that's just a square, but how does it know what the thickness is when it's rotating it?
The browser handles all that for you. So there's actually, it distorts since everything in the DOM is essentially square, it distorts it using the view, something from WebGL or OpenGL we think of called the view matrix. So it's geometrically plotting points at all these corners, rotating them in 3D space, and then at the last step, it squashes it down to 2D by saying what is the depth of this point and how far has it gone toward the vanishing point. And that's actually, the browser's handling that for us, and we can give it a lot of instructions for how to do that too. So here is actually this demo. These are 6 divs, but each of them has been transformed to move around the faces of the cube, and more detail on that in a second. But in terms of the way it's transformed and flattened to put onto the screen, we actually have a property with all the vendor prefixes called perspective. And so the larger that value, the farther away the vanishing point is. Anyone remember from art class the idea of a vanishing point as you draw stuff out? So the browser is doing all that for us, and with the perspective value, we're actually saying how far away that vanishing point is.
Are you manipulating the vanishing point of the parent div that houses all of those squares,
Yes.
or is it on the one?
On each individual? No, it's actually inherited down from the outermost div that we're manipulating. So everything rendered within it does that. You could probably do individual perspective origins and perspective values on everything within the hierarchy and get some crazy wonky results. Or render them in different colors or to different channels if you wanted. Yeah, so it's inheriting all that down, cascading that. So with 3D translations, we have the same idea, and these are just being applied to the outermost container. So we have our same idea of the translation of Y values, or rotating it, the same ideas. And since I definitely want to kind of show you guys how this is working. See the outermost container isn't big enough, so it's clipping all that off because the overflow is off. So within this thing, we actually, there's all the UI for our loops to show what the translation is, but these are actually just spans. So you see I have it selected in the DOM inspector. You can see the span being manipulated, and that's that face of the cube, or the left side. And so these have properties, there's a great slide in a minute on this, but basically taking that transformation origin to the edge of it, so when you rotate it, it flips around itself. As opposed to the default in the center, so you can actually have all these things have boundaries and seams, and that's how you achieve effect like a cube.
All right, this might be a dumb question. Are there event handlers in HTML5?
Absolutely. So any animation that you set, you can listen for the animation being complete in JavaScript. So basically, the flow may go something like this in JavaScript. So the DOM element has CSS3 properties set up to transform certain, transition across certain values if they're changed. So there's a base value, and if you ever change it, it's going to animate it across, according to certain rules that you set up in the CSS.
So you could have somebody drag that 3D cube and spin it around in 3D space, just like a modeler.
Definitely, and there, something we use at Match, we've used a lot, is something called ice cream. So on the native phones, with a very tall page, you can flick your finger and it will scroll up with inertia and bounce at the end and all of this stuff. If you want special regions within your page to behave that way, we actually use a plugin called iScroll that uses that technique to create these transitions. So you begin by listening for the beginning of the touch, and then you drag it under the finger, and if you have enough momentum when the touch ends, then you go ahead and set an animation into motion, and you listen for the finish of it. And so it's you can do all kinds of things with it, absolutely. So something from 3D, we have something called backface culling, which is the backface visibility property in CSS. The idea is sort of a painter's algorithm idea. If you draw things, so if you're painting, like an oil painting or something, and you paint the sky, and you paint the mountains, then you paint the trees, you know, and so you draw the things at the back and draw forward. So with this type of idea, that translated into 3D. It's called the painter's algorithm. And that will, you draw things from the back forward, but you can optimize. Since everything's slow in the computer, at least it used to be much more so, you would decide which pixels you don't need to draw anymore because something up close to the camera is going to hide it. So you don't want to draw the mountain, you don't want to paint the mountains back there because there's this giant, whatever, in the foreground, tree in the example. So this idea of backface culling comes from that. So the idea is if you have a polygon, or in this case a div, and it's if it's facing you, you draw it. As soon as it rotates to where it's that paper thin 2D, you know, it's straight on, it's just a straight line, and then beyond that, it's invisible because the direction it's facing is more than 180 degrees away from the camera. So if you take the example of a sphere or something, or a cube, you don't want to have to draw the things that are invisible because something in front of them is blocking. So the backface visibility lets you draw that anyway. Say, for example, if you're doing translucent faces on a cube, then you'd be able to see things behind it. So this right here is just the backface visibility property. And so you can see that when that is disabled, it is totally gone. This thing is just continuously rotating. But while it's facing away from you, you don't see it. Versus having that on, you do see it. So that's, maybe that's minutia. But if you're trying to draw something and it's not showing up, that's maybe a thing to try. Okay, so here's a better example where we're dealing with the multiple faces of the cube. So you cannot see that hidden face at all because there are things drawn in front of it. So, but if it was all to be translucent, we'd want to go ahead and draw it even when it was in the background. So here's the Slinky demo. Oh, actually, this is even better. So this is there's an outermost container that's slowly rotating. The front is the parent beneath that, and then the top, the left, the right, and the bottom are the children of that, and then the child at the bottom, in terms of the DOM hierarchy, is the back face down here. So as you rotate just the top and the left and the bottom, and then you find, did you notice something very important is that that last one that's attached to the bottom rotates with the bottom. You don't have to animate it individually. So then when it comes all the way up, you've now folded the box. Chris's talk is called Unfolding the Box Model. It's a good talk. So here's a Slinky demo. So basically, definitely show you this in the DOM inspector. This is about 30 divs, each containing a little thick circle. And so you just rotate one after another, and every time you rotate one, subsequent ones also inherit that. And the browser takes care of all this for you, so you can picture a lot of things you might do. And here's the beautiful DOM that results in that. So each segment gets the little slinky effect. doesn't have to be a simple circle or a box face. You can it'll transform images for you. So you have an image inside a square. And I think this is broken. Hold on. So this example is something that looks like tiles. It's pretty good, but let's see if that. Sorry, I'll put these up in the notes, but there's a version of this where each one of these actually looks like a little square of stone marble, and it pops out of exactly where it is, and the texture of the marble moves just right along with it. And so in this case, there's just a hover state on each of these with a slightly different transform value to move it up a little bit, and so it just animates out for us. I don't have the images. Okay, looks like the rest of that demo broke, but we can go look at some of those things on the internet. Any questions at this point about just fundamentally how those things are achieved? Or?
Which browsers work best with this stuff right now?
Anything, some of it only works in IE 10, but some of it does work in IE 9. Other than that, pretty universally.
And what breaks down first on really super complicated images, page load, or just the slowness of the animation?
Some of the 3D transform and transition properties just aren't supported in the other browsers. In terms of performance, here's a crazy example. So here is JavaScript changing CSS transform properties to create a Doom-like first-person shooter. Everything in here is a div in a giant hierarchy. Here, I think we even, what did it say shoot was? Was it enter?
Spacebar?
I'm disappointed.
Left click?
It doesn't look like we can blow up the barrels, but everything here is a div. In fact, let's just get someone to get irritated with me if I try and do it on it. So this is a massive team. You can imagine what the hierarchy looks like to achieve this. But you can do ridiculous things that are, just only demo worthy. So I clicked on a ceiling tile. And so there are just countless planes. They have IDs on up through the 200s. That just inherit from some master scene and get transformed. The parent container would get some, you translate 3D values as you move around via JavaScript, and then everything else inherits and does it. You can also use it for more practical things like e-catalogs, sort of stuff. Although this is actually kind of the ultimate Google demo. Has anyone seen this? It's so they did this beautiful pop-up book. That is just an enormous hierarchy of lovely images put together and thrown away. And it's page after page talking about why you should spend money with Google advertising. So they may be onto something. I think they make some money. I mean, just down to this, where even the little accordion folds on the hand are deep series of elements. Simulating how they're zoomed down to the street view feature works. So Google, they put so much work into Chrome. They really seem to have the best, some of the best demos on, for example, WebGL or some of the other HTML5 technologies, because they've put the effort into building a browser that can do all these things, and trying to get it in everyone's hands instead of Safari and Internet Explorer. So, but this is, you know, just a huge team of people doing something amazing here. It's like so just a series of divs. They have translucent PNGs, ambient animation, a little bit of rotation. JavaScript's picking up the mouse movements to transform the entire container. And so you can switch out the various PNG sprites that are in those elements. And with different, say, stormy clouds. And so it's just a darker PNG. Or maybe something looks more like an explosion. This even has the Michael Bay set. So, speaking of transformers.
Chris, do you know of any SAS-based templates that you could use for the basic CSS animation transforms that you would use to do a lot of this?
I think SAS-based templates would be good for getting around all the vendor prefix issues.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
But really, it's I think the paper cutout book model is a good way of thinking about how all your different pieces are going to interact with each other. So it really goes from the DOM structure back to the style sheet. And I'm sure there are common use cases that there may be some pre-built things for. But in general, it's just kind of build it out as you need it to be, unless you want to use one of the better tools. So I'll definitely put all these in the notes.
Is there anybody working like on a 3D space that you can actually have an IDE, kind of like AutoCAD, all the Autodesk tools?
Sure. I'm sure there are projects like that out there. After a certain extent, I think the Doom-like first-person shooter demo is kind of ridiculous. It's interesting to show for this, but after a certain point, you want to begin using WebGL to do some of these things because you have pretty similar support.
How about the amazing book made in CSS3? Do you think that's does that fall in the line of WebGL also?
Actually, I think this is beautiful in CSS3. Some of the things that would slow down on WebGL is if this was on a larger display or say a Retina MacBook or something like that. Being able to do it in CSS3 might be a lot better. I think this is a lot more complicated than what most people would need to do. But I don't know, somewhere between this and the Doom would be where you'd switch over. But this is a lot easier to use, without a doubt, than WebGL. I wanted to show some of the tools that are out there for doing this, at least to generate code. Maybe do something in an interface that gets you 99% of the way there, and you can, since It's just web-based code. You can take it out and adjust it beyond that, add your JavaScript behavior. There are some excellent tools. And one of them came out from Adobe. So this whole alternative Flash thing is not something that they are completely against. Here's a tool that I believe they probably did everything they possibly could to make look and feel like Flash in whatever ways are possible, that at the end of that will generate out your CSS and HTML. Let's see if they're... So they give you an ID where you can drop in your assets from. Let's see if the Wi-Fi will actually get decent quality here. Okay, there we go. So you just drag around everything. It's setting, it's keeping the DOM in mind for you. It's setting your transitions and your keyframes and giving you a timeline, which is very Flash-like. And at the end, it'll just generate this out for you. And there are several tools. This is part of their creative cloud suite. It's like a $20 a month kind of thing, which there are a couple of great free ones. It really would save you a lot of time creating these things. Basically, I wanted to open it up to questions at this point. I didn't know how technical the audience would be, or really where to go from here.
That last GUI, the app that you were showing, I haven't messed with the Adobe's library with this at all. I've just hand coded. So, but I have an After Effects background.
Yeah.
And so
exactly.
that interface is the exact same interface I used to use in After Effects. But are you familiar when that exports, if it exports, and what browsers it supports, or is there polyfills it pulls out with it, or?
Well, I don't. It's more likely to compile a Flash movie for you for the older browsers than to do polyfills. But I mean, I suppose it's a form of polyfill. But this is going to output everything vendor prefixed and properly with fallback code and everything. Whatever you need to do. Unlike After Effects, you can't pre-render huge complicated clips. You have to keep in mind that this is all going to be on whatever computer's out there. But especially if you're targeting a tablet or something, this frame rate drops and things like this. But, I mean, the worst thing that happens if a transition is too heavy is it's just going to skip some frames and end up at the end of where you told it to transform. So.
Inside Canvas text?
Canvas, 2D Canvas is separate. You're able to draw to it in detail. So, for example, I don't know if this is it's not the best Canvas to have, but it's terrible. Actually, I'll just get to it from GitHub. But Canvas is just sort of a blank slate that you use JavaScript commands to draw onto. So 2D Canvas, you could copy images onto it, draw circles, draw text onto it, things like that, and then animate it over time. 3D Canvas is WebGL, which is so here's this thing up here is a 2D canvas, and we're just drawing a bunch of little squares onto it. And so you can add a lot of behaviors in JavaScript or something like that. One of the things I like best about CSS3 transforms is you can take your canvas and then animate, because it's just a DOM element. You can then shift your canvas around and do different things, which is type of technique Vista uses. So this was an IE10 very HTML5 demo that came out. And so in this particular game, there are several canvases on the screen at any given moment. So this, if we were to inspect this, if it would let us. This area that I'm moving the ground up and down in about these bounds is one canvas, as is the little guy. And so you could actually apply CSS transforms on these different canvases themselves.
I've heard of a JavaScript framework called 3.js. I don't know if you've heard of it. Is it also based on WebGL?
Oh yes, 3.js is it's based on WebGL and it falls back to 2D canvas for those that don't have it. There are many very good demos on this. It's actually a really good place to start if you're familiar with JavaScript. It has this object-oriented you can define your scene in much the way like a gaming framework might let you do it, and put in all your geometry and everything, and then it will actually be responsible for translating it to actual 3D canvas here. On this browser, it's going to be 3D. Yeah, 3.js is a great place to start. A lot of adoption on that. Well, if there are no further questions, I'll get the code examples out there for those who want to dig deep.
Because we have time, I'm asking this question. I always wonder, like, how is the background? So do you create that all the background, like when you're seeing this last one, all this mesh stuff, is it being created and then you just move it around? Like how much of it is created, how much is built on the fly?
Okay.
Like even the shooting example, if the background of the rooms and all that stuff, is it like already done, built, and then you just move in a certain path, or do you keep making them up as it?
Most of these things, the content, say the 3D geometry that's being drawn out, that's all created in advance, and then this is almost just like a rendering flow that's drawing some piece of that as you go along. So there are examples where you would dynamically, I've seen some games where you're flying through an infinite tunnel, avoiding obstacles. That kind of thing is on the fly. A lot of game creation and things like that is the content creation. Just like in web design, the images that are being shown is its own huge part of it too.
Is it possible to pull in a 3D object model?
It is, especially with 3.js. So you can export out of 3D Studio Max or something like that, and of course you have to keep the geometry level reasonable, but then we can go into that. That's much more WebGL.
Gotcha.
Transforming pieces of the DOM are just you're basically taking your rectangles and squares and just shifting them with perspective and then chaining those together to make boxes or cutout shapes or things like that. Well, thank you for coming. How do we want to do the CSS3 animation book giveaway? Who would be most likely to sit down and go through it and try it out?
Oh, I would.
I think you were first.
Really?
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you all for
Thank you
coming.
very much.